Fish 26. Feminism versus patriarchy. Feminism, defined. Feminism is arguably the penultimate evil at present, because feminism is based on the misguided assumption that women are equal to, or even superior to, men. Those who undertake an academic course in gender, feminist studies at college or university, could most probably fill this page with definitions of feminism, but there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the core of feminism is the advocacy of women to become men, in all but genitalia. The only institution more destructive to human society than feminism is illicit governance, see Chapter 22. Equality is nonsensical. Equality is non-existent in this transactional sphere. Equality exists purely in abstract concepts such as mathematics. For instance, 1 plus 1 is precisely equal to 2, and arguably on the atomic and quantum levels, e.g., 2 hydrogen atoms are essentially uniform, as are 2 gluon subatomic particles. Even identical twins are not perfectly identical in every possible criterion. Geneticists have discovered that a pair of so-called identical twins share, on average, about only 94% of their genetics by the time they are born. Mothers of such twins can instinctually differentiate between them, since there are always distinguishing features, both psychological and somatic. Unfortunately, for a great many persons, the objective fact that equality among humans is non-existent is impossible to accept, since they are afflicted with what is known as an egalitarian, leftist, mentality. At this juncture, it is highly recommended that one read the glossary entries under leftism, adharma, and dharma, to understand this particularly pernicious, sinister mindset, and Chapter 12, to learn what constitutes true morality. The more intelligent leftists, adharmavadan, in Sanskrit, will begrudgingly admit that no two human beings can be equal, in terms of their capacities and capabilities, or in their mental or physical attributes, such as their beauty, strength, or wealth, but will vehemently argue that every single human is equal in their moral worth and/or dignity, and in rare instances, spiritually equal. However, if they were forced to choose between ending the life of either a serial rapist, or that of a guiltless monk or a nun, or, let's say, a newborn child, in the case of those leftists who are particularly hostile to religious institutions, I am sure that they would choose to have the rapist executed. That is because they have deemed that the life of the criminal to be of lesser, and thus unequal, moral value than that of an innocent baby, or that of a monastic. The nature of hierarchy. Like most species of animalia, and unquestionably in the case of our nearest relatives, the great apes, Homo sapiens society is founded on an unambiguously stratified configuration. The very pinnacle of humanity is the current world teacher, whilst the lowest members of society are pre-born babies, with every other human falling somewhere in that spectrum, for, as demonstrated in the previous section, no two humans can be exactly equal in every way, and certainly not in their authority over others. Even some insect social orders, notably bees and ants, are necessarily organized hierarchically. Read chapters 19 to 25 of this Holy Scripture, FISH, to learn more about this hierarchical basis of human society. So, although a female can exhibit superior traits, skills, etc., to some men, a woman can never ever have authority over a man. Therefore, the assertion that women are subordinate to men is based solely on this notion of authority, and not on any particular attribute, such as intelligence, wisdom, beauty, physical strength, or artistic talent. Simply because a woman may be stronger or more highly educated than her husband, for instance, does not give that woman the right to instruct her master in any way. No true man has ever been attracted to a domineering, bossy female. If you have read this far into my book, it is most likely that you are in agreement with this incisive perspective. However, because this chapter of A Final Instruction Sheet for Humanity is sometimes posted in social media websites on the internet, and emailed to select individuals, independently from the entire book, many persons, notably feminists, both male and female, will undoubtedly find these notions of hierarchy and authority to be somewhat alien to their world view. This is despite the fact that those leftists, feminists invariably acquiesce to the presumed authority of certain individuals, in more than a few facets of their own lives, such as when obeying their employers, acknowledging the authority of a judge or a magistrate in a court of law, or when following the directions of a road traffic officer. Truth be told, no true man would ever descend to the level of accepting counsel from any of his subordinates. A man should fully obey his allotted masters, such as his father, grandfather, uncle, employer, or priest, and never emasculate himself by submitting to the dictates of a mere female, or any other lesser. Of course, in past millennia, it was unnecessary to explicate the reasons why adult males are inherently superior in authority to females. Most everybody, both men and women, accepted that claim without argument, as it seemed quite sensible. However, at the time of writing, especially in the Western world, very few understand that the reason for this assertion is due simply to it being part of the natural hierarchy of society. Only emasculated, feminized men are unable to comprehend this very basic fact of life. Imagine the scenario where a woman provides the material requirements of her family, physically protects her family from harm, teaches and instructs her husband and their children. Does this appear to follow the natural order of things? Obviously not. Therefore, my point is made. Yet, despite my point being made, the typical leftist, Adamavadan, in Sanskrit, will stubbornly refuse to accept this patently evident truism. Usurping gender roles. Feminist ideology commonly manifests as the desire for women to perform the societal role of the opposite gender, that is to say, partaking in intrinsically male activities, such as studying at educational institutions, working for a wage, or building business enterprises, or even more preposterously, usurping the position of a national leader or the role of a member of the holy priesthood. Feminism also advocates for preferential treatment of females in institutions that may have traditionally favored men and/or boys, even when the tables have been completely turned around the other way, so to speak. In a nutshell, feminists suffer from the psychological disorder termed penis envy, and fundamentally yearn to become males in every conceivable way, sometimes even biologically, despite the demonstrably incontrovertible fact that transitioning from one gender to the other gender being a physiological impossibility. This explains the reason why female feminists are typically manly. After all, if feminism is defined as the aspiration for women to be like men, then it is obvious that feminists are not feminine. Conversely, as a general rule, the more feministic and gynocentric is a man, the more effeminate and uxorious is his behavior and his manner. This aspiration of a person wishing to seize the position of another person, deemed to be of higher value, is a common proclivity in males as well, such as in the case of working class men who consider themselves to be rulers, kings or priests, gurus. Every so-called priest, and every national leader on earth, with virtually no exceptions, is either a worker, a businessman, or even more risibly, a mere female, who is literally stealing the occupation of an authentic guru, in the case of religious leaders, or arrogating the role of a king, in the case of the ruler of every nation or country on earth. Such persons are, therefore, full-time criminals, and ought to be censured. Only a man with the requisite qualities, the commitment, and the willingness, ought to serve in those two supremely important positions, see chapters 20 and 21 in this respect. So, proving that this author is not a misogynist, the male propensity to usurp social roles is arguably more serious than it is in the case of females. After all, which garbage collector would not want to become the ruler of his nation, given the opportunity? Such ambitions, one cannot blame. Feminism equals Marxism. Feminists are victims of the slavish mentality that the instigators of that evil, pernicious ideology, Karl Marx and the so-called globalist elite, have always wanted them to be. The desire to serve is a natural propensity of humans, but one ought to serve a lawful authority. It is extremely unfortunate that the vast majority of women are unable to see the obvious truth that feminist ideology wants the destruction of women, as well as society as a whole, as can clearly be seen at present. At least it is clearly seen by any decent, wise and intelligent person. Of course, from the very beginning of our species, there were most probably numerous individual women who attempted to assert dominance over their menfolk, But it was not until Herr Marx and his minions formulated their insidious egalitarian ideology of communism that feminism started to make a significant impact on human society, at least in the so-called West, and now too, in even the most conservative cultures. The debasement of the female. Due to feminist indoctrination and lack of proper discipline, as a consequence of an increasingly profane and secular world, modern women have become extremely debased. The typical woman nowadays is afflicted with bitterness, uncontrolled emotions, especially jealousy, gross immodesty, greed, arrogance, misery, snobbishness, and loneliness due to a false sense of independence, with hardly a single noble quality. In those gynocentric societies that are dominated by feminism, men are urged to avoid any unnecessary contact with the opposite gender. Those heterosexual males who disregard this sage advice will invariably regret their choices, either after experiencing false allegations against them, the destruction of their families through divorce, or after constant rejection by snobby women with a false sense of entitlement. However, let it be made clear, the greatest enemy of males is not the opposite sex, but those uxorious, white knight, so-called, men, who do the bidding of feminist ideologues, since they have far greater power than females, despite being truly pathetic excuses for men. A humorous example of reverse gender roles. Because the pernicious ideology of feminism is so thoroughly entrenched in most all modern societies, I would like to give a rather humorous illustration of why it is essential for the traditional gender roles to perdure. Any feminist who becomes angry at the proclamation that the only lawful role of females is as daughters, wives and mothers, should be asked the following question: would you, assuming you're heterosexual, of course, be attracted to a man who wears a French maid's uniform, and works as a housekeeper, preparing meals, laundering and mending clothes, and doing the weekly grocery shopping? If not, then you ought not reprove any man who is repulsed by a woman who dresses in a pantsuit, works as a loud and brash lawyer, and drives a fast European sports car. And, in case you consider the former scenario unrealistic, you obviously have not resided here in the Philippines, where many men work as maids. In fact, the family residing opposite to me, in my flat, condominium, building employs such a man. Such men are called houseboys, here in the land of transvestites, as I affectionately refer to the Philippine Islands. Obviously, at least obvious to any intelligent and wise soul, unless proper gender roles are adhered to, modern society will continue its course of disintegration, until there are practically no humans remaining. And those who do remain will be devolved Homo sapiens, since the trend has been for the most intelligent humans to reproduce at non-replacement rates, or to avoid reproduction altogether. In fact, in recent years, there has emerged a movement called antinatalism, whose proponents, both male and female, argue that human reproduction is unbeneficial to society for various reasons. Additionally, we have the appearance of the MGTOW movement, men going their own way, a faction of men who choose to avoid romantic relationships with the opposite gender. Why, for example, would a wealthy and intelligent businessman risk mating with a woman who, statistically, is very likely assured of stealing his children and his hard-earned assets? Feminist women, do you believe that men ought to be the ones to give birth to your children? It sounds like a hysterically ridiculous question, right? And indeed it is. That is because, whether by design or by evolution, almost definitely by both, assuming that the metaphysics of this book is accurate, the female members of most every species of Animalia are best equipped to gestate offspring. Similarly, until at least the past half-century or so, especially in the so-called West, where men have become increasingly more feminized by Marxist radicals and by poor nutrition, men are far better furnished with the physical, psychological, and emotional apparatus to perform the roles that we men have always performed, notwithstanding the fairy tale anecdotes one often hears about there existing a matriarchy in days of yore. Even if there was a matriarchal society at some place and time in the past, it is absolutely certain that the males were not the sex giving birth to children. Gynocentrism. Furthermore, many, if not most, married men who have not been Divorce rate, to use a rather crude but apt term, are still married due only to the fact that they choose to not properly discipline their thralls, out of fear that their wives will destroy their lives. Shortly after marrying my second, so-called, wife, we settled here in the Philippines, and I said to myself, thank God that we are migrating to a country where the government is not gynocentric, and therefore, will not encourage my new wife to abandon her marriage for any capricious reason, and will not prevent me from asserting my authority as the head of the family, as does the illegitimate government of my homeland. Little did I realize, however, that the Filipino government, that is, the so-called law of penis, was even more gynocentric than that of Australia. Not long afterwards, I was forced to either tolerate my wife's verbal insolence and physical violence, or else punish her for her heinous crimes, and risk spending the remainder of my life rotting away in an uninhabitable Filipino prison. Therefore, I would estimate that a huge proportion of marriages, in both the East and the West, are those in which the husband is reluctant to properly discipline his spouse, as well as his own children, to a lesser extent, out of fear of being persecuted by his own government. See the glossary entry under punishment persecution. Patriarchy. Patriarchy is defined as a system of society or government in which the father or eldest male is head of the family, and familial descent is traced through the male ancestral line. In recent times, due to the objectively immoral, wicked, evil, demonic feminist movement, it is usually defined more harshly as a system of society or government in which men in general hold the power, and women are largely excluded from it. As clearly and soundly demonstrated in more than one chapter of FISH, men and women have quite distinct duties and responsibilities within human society. Adult males naturally fall into one of the four social classes, that is, priests, monarchs, farmland and business owners, and workers, whilst females are meant to serve their superiors as daughters, in the case of girls, and wives, in the case of women, by performing household chores and raising children. Sadly, of course, a large proportion of the population no longer adheres to this gender role dichotomy, particularly in the Western countries, and the chances are, if you have read this far into this holiest scripture of all, you are not among them. Radical feminists, of both sexes, invariably become noticeably upset, and sometimes aggressively violent, when they are confronted with even any mention of patriarchal ideology in public dialogue, as they wrongly believe that women should have an equal role in the governance of families and in the ruling bodies of society, and often that women ought to rule nations, as in a matriarchy, since they incorrectly assume that women are less warmongering than men. Such militant feminists and social constructionists have surmised that gender roles and gender inequity are instruments of power, and that they have become social norms to maintain control over women. Of course, power dynamics do exist in society, and provided that power is exerted according to the ethos of Dharma, the law, and societal rules, it is not at all a caustic thing. Constructionists would contend that sociobiological arguments serve to justify the oppression of women. And, by oppression, they are, in actual fact, referring to the reality that men have largely protected their womenfolk throughout human history, and in a huge number of cases, practically worship the opposite sex. See the glossary entry, gynocentrism, regarding this ugly phenomenon. When you peruse social media websites on the internet, do you generally see men belittling and scolding women, or rather, are the men desperately pursuing them? Obviously, throughout human history, some men have harmed some women, just as many women have harmed men. That has absolutely naught to do with patriarchy, but solely with sin and lawlessness. Most all Western countries are now matriarchal, in the sense that women have total and utter power over their menfolk, even if that power is enforced by other, so-called, males. This last quip ought not be construed to imply that criminal males should not be held accountable for their crimes, but that, in many, if not most, cases of suspected wrongdoing, the accused man is not only innocent of any transgressions but is, rather, the victim. If a man has abused a woman, he ought to be castigated by his legitimate authority, not by the minions of any corrupt state government. Personally, I have been jailed twice for being the casualty of physical assault and verbal insults by women making blatantly false allegations against me, a very skinny, old monastic priest, and honestly consider myself to be immensely gentle, loving and kind, including the heinous crime of rape, despite the fact that I have not once fornicated. Therefore, the fact that you, the reader of this holiest book of all, are alive and well, is due largely to the institution of patriarchy, which has protected your ancestral lineage from those barbarians who have not adhered to Dharma, holy and righteous norms, based on non-violence, and if you insist that patriarchy is intrinsically harmful, you are being blatantly hypocritical, and unwittingly invoking your very own demise. Patriarchy is the only system that is normal, natural, and necessary. It is normal, natural, and necessary for a father to take charge of his nuclear family, for a grandfather to take control of his extended family, for a chief to assert authority over his clan, all the way up to a true monarch, who is considered to be the father of his people, and finally to a genuine priest, prophet, ch. 20, who is father of his nation. It is impossible for the typical woman to properly execute the role of family, clan, national head, and even if a female was found who could competently lead her family, tribe, clan, or village, there will always be a male who could have fulfilled that role to an even more competent degree, unless, of course, the male population has been decimated by the ravages of war or disease, for example. Many rules have exceptions. Patriarchy. An anecdote. In order to provide just a single example of how the notion of patriarchy is grossly misunderstood by the vast majority of humans, especially in the liberal West, I will refer to a videograph monologue, entitled, Rape and Patriarchal Culture, his own capitalization, published on an internet website called YouTube, by a Zambian chap of European descent, who goes by the fake name, Swami Rahasya. Judging by the fact that he is male, albeit a truly pathetic, white knight, beta male, and that he uses the title, Swami, which is, almost invariably, the title of a monastic spiritual master, one could be forgiven for assuming that he is in support of all dharmic concepts, including patriarchy. However, this is the opposite of the truth, since he brazenly and wrongly asserts that rape is pretty much the basis of patriarchy. In fact, it may be the core power of patriarchy. Of course, he conveniently ignores the fact that a large proportion of sexual assaults are perpetrated by women. Anecdotally, I, the quintessential alpha male patriarch, have never sexually assaulted a solitary woman, though I have been falsely accused of such, by at least one or two filthy, fat Filipino females, yet I have been the victim of several rape attempts by oversexed women, during my lengthy stay in the Philippines. Before watching the video in question, I had never heard such incredibly ludicrous assertions outside the far-left community, usually spouted by filthy fat feminist females sporting neon-colored hairstyles. It is possible that Rahasya's poisonous, gynocentric viewpoint may be caused by his drug-taking habit, since, in all his internet videos, he is seen chain-smoking what appears to be toxic tobacco cigarettes, coupled with a severe testosterone deficiency. Hence one ought to be cautious when attributing malicious intent. In another video on his YouTube channel, entitled, The End of Patriarchy, the self-styled Tantra Master erroneously asserts that there was a time when humanity was matriarchal, and where the female leaders used men solely as tools for propagating the species. I can only assume that he was confusing B-grade science fiction movies of the 1960s with confirmed historical evidence, of which there is none, since any society that is truly matriarchal cannot survive for more than a short period of time, for reasons that ought be obvious after perusing this entire book. Also, this so-called renounced monk, Swami, is the common mistransliteration of Swami, a Sanskrit title for a mendicant monastic priest, claims that patriarchy is in decline, but this can never be the case, in the sense that the collapse of the patriarchy is equivalent to the complete destruction of human society. The only scenario in which society will not be decimated with the end of patriarchy is if male testosterone levels continues to decline, if public education institutions continue their Marxist indoctrination programs, and if food producers continue to contaminate food sources with chemicals and hormones that wrecks the cognitive capacity of the male, as well as female, population. This is because, the more that males are emasculated by the above pernicious agendas, the more likely they are to willingly accede power to women. Practically the only sensible thing said in Swami Rahasya's inane videos, is the assertion that the chief alpha male, by which he obviously means a king, ought to lead his army into battle, rather than sitting on his throne, protected in his castle. Frankly, I doubt that the Swami even knows the actual definition of the term alpha male. I asked him in the comments section of one of the aforementioned videos, but he has yet to respond to my very simple question, which is unsurprising, because he repeatedly refused to answer my even more simple question: are you vegan? Most probably due to being an animal-abusing carnist, like the vast majority of humanity, including so-called gurus. Far more hilarious than Swami Rahasya's idiotic opinions regarding patriarchy is the fact that he considers himself to be some kind of great religious leader, despite being a deluded, drug-addicted carnist. Unfortunately, this is the norm in this age of darkness, Kali Yuga, in which working-class men, as well as women, pretending to be spiritual masters, Brahmana, in Sanskrit, are lauded by the ignorant masses, or in Rahasya's case, my students are mostly high, and are often extreme, achievers. They are often among the elite in their areas, from yoga, therapy and sexology to rocket science, chemistry, computing and physics. The implication seems to be that Rahasya, or whatever is his real name, see the glossary entry, name, personal, is such a great sage that he attracts the most exalted followers, I would hate to use the term, disciples, since there is little doubt in my mind that there is no discipline being administered by that pathetic excuse of a man. Because rocket scientists, chemists, and physicists, by mere virtue of their career paths, are automatically fully enlightened saints, correct? Incorrect. It seems this delusional feminist stooge forgot to attend the class on logical fallacies during his seminary years. Of course, this last quip was purely sarcastic, since Swami Rahasya was never trained in any kind of seminary worthy of the name, but is just a simple worker, who began, incompetently, teaching Vedanta and Tantra at the request of a bunch of even more deluded fools. As demonstrated in chapter 20 of this holy scripture, an actual spiritual master is necessarily a member of the holy priesthood and teaches yoga and dharma to seminarians, student priests, and kings, rather than training women to become bossy, pugnacious feminists, as the abject pansy, Swami Rahasya, admits to doing on his public website. That is the antithesis of authentic Dharma, see the glossary entry, Dharma. Again, welcome to this age of darkness. Woman, defined. Woman n. Place. Woman. She who gives, woe, to, man, therefore, woe, man. Of course, almost every woman on earth, and even most men, will accuse the author of being a misogynist for composing the above mock dictionary definition of woman, what to speak of the entire chapter, plus the previous chapter, but the bitter truth must be proclaimed. Factually, I love every human and non-human animal equally, in that I want the best for everyone. The best thing for non-human animals is for them to be left alone, as far as practical. The best thing for women is for them to adhere to the normal, natural, and necessary function that they have been designed, evolved to do, and unless they keep to their natural roles, society shall further advance towards its impending doom. Though I've searched repeatedly, I have not found what I was looking for. Only 1 out of 1,000 men is virtuous, but not one woman. Ecclesiastes 7:28. The Holy Bible, New Living Translation. We must not allow ourselves to be deflected by the feminists who are anxious to force us to regard the two sexes as completely equal in position and worth. Sigismund Shlomo Freud, Austrian neurologist. It is a naive sort of feminism that insists that women prove their ability to do all the things that men do. This is a distortion and a travesty. Men have never sought to prove that they can do all the things women do. Why subject women to purely masculine criteria? Women can and ought to be judged by the criteria of femininity, for it is in their femininity that they participate in the human race. And femininity has its limitations. So has masculinity. That is what we've been talking about. To do this is not to do that. To be this is not to be that. To be a woman is not to be a man. To be married is not to be single, which may mean not to have a career. To marry this man is not to marry all the others. A choice is a limitation. From Let Me Be a Woman, by Elizabeth Elliot. Belgian-born American writer. The feminist movement taught women to see themselves as victims of an oppressive patriarchy. Self-imposed victimhood is not a recipe for happiness. My analysis is that the gays are about 5% of the attack on marriage in this country, and the feminists are about 95%. Feminism is doomed to failure because it is based on an attempt to repeal and restructure human nature. Anyone with a child knows that children learn about the world through binary options: up or down, hot or cold, big or little, inside or outside, wet or dry, good or bad, boy or girl, man or woman. But the radical feminists, who staff women's studies departments at most colleges, have propagated the idea that we have to get rid of the gender binary, along with the expectation of distinct roles for men and women. Phyllis Stuart Schlafly, American attorney and conservative activist. The feminist agenda is not about equal rights for women. It is about a socialist, anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. Marion Gordon, Pat Robertson. American media mogul and Protestant Christian minister. It seems to be the fashion nowadays for a girl to behave as much like a man as possible. Well, I won't. I'll make the best of being a girl and be as nice a specimen as I can, sweet and modest, a dear, dainty thing with clothes smelling all sweet and violety, a soft voice, and pretty, womanly ways. Since I'm a girl, I prefer to be a real one. Jessie Bell Manzerg, aka Mrs. George de Horn-Vaisley. English writer. P.S. The fact that, upon searching the internet for anti-feminism quotations to use in this chapter, many, if not most, of the quotations I saw were actually in favor of feminism, proves just how gynocentric, feminist, and Adamic, a more apposite and accurate term for leftist, are most major business corporations of the Western world, at least in the era in which this book was composed. See Adama in glossary.